A group of dedicated social work students were interviewed for an internship position to work with an Indigenous Australian community in the North Kimberley. They were asked a range of questions, and these were their responses.
As a social worker, how would you approach building cultural competency when working with Indigenous Australians?
Firstly, I would approach building cultural competency by strengthening my knowledge and being, ensuring my attitudes and values respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and recognise the immense diversity of their background and the unique attributes and abilities within Indigenous communities. Social workers also need to be advocates for human rights, social justice and non-racist practice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And this begins by challenging others' oppressive and racist attitudes and modelling the right behaviour in my own actions. Secondly, in order to successfully achieve cultural competence, social workers working in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community must gain a sophisticated understanding of their culture. Knowledge of the specific Indigenous culture you are working with and their customs allows you to more successfully engage with clients. Knowledge of the history of Indigenous Australian society, specifically in relation to separation and assimilation, gives a social worker the ability to understand the way in which certain institutions operate in discriminatory ways, as well as how intergenerational trauma continues to impact Indigenous communities today. This aspect of cultural competency, however, also allows a social worker to identify the way characteristics of strength and resilience characterise the Australian Indigenous community as a whole. Lastly, I commit to lifelong learning. This is an essential to building and maintaining cultural competency over time. I understand that for effective communication, listening is more beneficial than questioning, and I will use this skill while working with Indigenous Australians. I recognise that, although not always easy, critical reflection is crucial for social workers, and I commit to building this skill daily. Considering my own worldviews, expectations, preconceptions and personal influences would be key in developing a trusting and respectful relationship with Indigenous Australian clients. Additionally, speaking clearly and respectfully to clients from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, while being aware of their cultural differences and how these may impact upon our relationship, are key skills that I would employ to ensure the continuous development of cultural competency.
What are some approaches to developing an awareness of cultural and personal identity?
There are two main approaches to draw on when developing an awareness of cultural and personal identity. These are reflective practice and good supervision. Reflective practice overlaps with self-reflective thinking nicely. It's the process of looking back on one's actions during and responses to a situation in order to identify our own strengths and weaknesses, with the intention of informing on how to improve in the future. There are a number of strengths associated with using reflective practice, which include reflective practice encouraging us to be open and honest with ourselves and to explore the merits and reasoning behind our own ideas, attitudes and approaches to an issue. Working through this process can help us to identify situations where we haven't acted in a way that aligns with our values and that of our profession and our employing organisation, which provides an opportunity for us to learn and improve. In practice, social workers frequently have to think on their feet, informing decisions based on information already available to them. Identifying gaps and weaknesses in these may inform the theories, research and professional knowledge bases that may prove useful to our practice in the future. Finally, reflective practice also helps us to focus on accepting that our values and attitudes can change as we learn and gain different experiences. Therefore, it's necessary to cultivate a habit of reflective practice in order to maintain thoughtful insight into our work as social workers. Some of the weaknesses associated with reflective practice can be that reflective thinking is quite a personal process. If done in complete isolation, there's no way to guarantee that our self-analysis will be objective or entirely honest or relevant at all. It can be difficult to understand how we might remain accountable to engaging in the practice of reflective thinking. It will vary person to person, but some who apply reflective thinking may overthink or overemphasize mistakes, errors, and situations where an intervention didn't work as intended. And the entire self-reflective process can be incredibly time-consuming. The second approach I mentioned was good supervision, which entails oversight of the work being carried out. This ensures service users receive the intended outcome. Some additional strengths associated with this include supervisors are in a position to assist social workers to develop professionally. Due to the complexities of social work, the learning and improvement process never really stops. Having an outsider's perspective can aid in identifying areas for improvement, which will help contribute to maintaining high practice standards for the profession as a whole. As supervisors provide advice, direction and feedback on a particular topic, they are in a unique position to help social workers negotiate a difficult practice situation, and supervisors can ensure that staff are provided with emotional support where required and appropriate. Some of the weaknesses associated with supervision include the fact that the quality of a supervisor can be poor, which can negatively affect the benefits that a practicing social worker may receive from working with them. It's possible to feel that you're overly dependent on the supervisor or that you're not in a position to disagree with whatever advice they provide, and you may feel that the supervisor is attempting to micromanage your practice.
What is the importance of having an awareness of cultural and personal identity?
I believe it's important to work on developing an awareness and understanding of our cultural and personal identities and how this will influence our practice. Without such an awareness, social workers risk using unintended and unidentified biases, values, assumptions and attitudes to inform our identification of problems and the problem-solving techniques we choose. This could lead to practices and outcomes that do not consider the cultural values and context of the client and consequently may inadequately address the client's needs. In Australian social work practice, we have seen how the values and perspective of dominant culture can translate into social policies that negatively impact on all aspects of Indigenous Australians in particular.
What do you think is the best way to approach community collaboration and development?
In regards to community development, especially within an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, I think the most important thing is recognising that you need to approach development in a different way than how you would with a non-Indigenous community. In order to achieve successful collaboration, it's important not to let bureaucracy determine your practice. Maintaining a relationship of trust within the community involves engaging with close-knit networks of families in an informal way, being creative and tailoring your responses to fit that specific community. Your ability to collaborate with the community is dependent on maintaining a good line of communication with elders and other trusted leaders, and most importantly, actively listening to their input and feedback, whether it's supportive or critical of your own ideas.
What are the key components to ensure clinical competency while working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
Basing practice off the idea that social problems are built into a society and don't reflect personal characteristics is one way of ensuring clinical competence. I think this structural approach is important in particular because it encourages reflective practice, where social workers reflect on their own privilege and how the disprivileging of Indigenous communities throughout history affects their needs. It also involves heavy collaboration with the community and the use of discourses that are more sensitive to the oppression of Indigenous people. A limitation of a structural approach is that as of now, there's still a limited understanding of how effective reflective practice is as a clinical approach. For social workers adhering to government regulations about evidence-based practice, this could be problematic. However, the structural approach gives communities a say in the service that's being delivered to them, so it has potential to empower the community. Reflective practice is also a useful alternative to traditional practice theories that are not sensitive to Indigenous customs.
A decolonising perspective is helpful when working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's important to recognise and reflect as social workers to recognise the impact of colonisation and prioritising the community's perspectives. And this includes recognising our privileged position and our biases around this. Secondly, it enables us to understand the experience of colonisation and the ongoing impact, and this can help us to accurately diagnose trauma-based issues. The perspective also encourages building of good rapport as an agent of change, and it's about asking the community to tell their story. From research that I've done, I feel that recognising the importance of hearing people's stories from the viewpoint of decolonisation rather than a damage-centred approach is important. We consider the politics of the experience when we hear these stories, and when a person's story is told from this perspective, it gives a much greater understanding of their issues rather than simply talking about the initial problem being presented. It's important to take time to deconstruct their story and accurately reconstruct it as an honest and truthful account. And this then gives the whole community a way of telling their truth and the real story of their history.